All right, hey there, AP Europeans. We are still in the throes of talking about topics 3.6 and 3.7 on the balance of power and absolutism, but we're going to turn attention over to the East on this one. Russia will come up in a little bit, but we probably need to take a couple minutes and catch up with what's going on the rest of the eastern part of this European map. So we saw this map briefly in class, but it was kind of like the full view. I have tried to zoom in more on the eastern side of things. Today, we're really focused on what's happening with the Holy Roman Empire is over here in the midst of everything, and then the Ottoman Empire, and then Poland, the Lithuanian Commonwealth, more on them in a moment. But then, well, let's just talk about like what's happening with this balance of power. Uh, on the decline, I talked about on a separate section of some online notes that Spain is on the decline in the West. Well, in the East, we've got like three entities that are on the decline. One of them is the Holy Roman Empire. It still exists after 1648 at the end of the 30 Years' War, but the Treaty of Westphalia basically divided it up into the various little entities that you can kind of see scattered out around like the middle part of this map. So I don't really have much of anything else extra to say about that. So the Holy Roman Empire is in fact starting to dissolve into a bunch of separate little kingdoms and principalities. The Ottoman Empire is much bigger than at this point than what it was is in today. Well, at their decline, at their end in 1917. So Turkey is over here, but Greece and Yugoslavia and Romania, this is all a lot of Ottoman control. In our Peter the Great video, they talked about how Russia didn't have any ports on the southern side of the country, and that's because the Ottomans are fairly dominant. Well, the Ottomans are dominant up through the 1640s and 1650s, but by the end of the century they are going to cease their westward expansion. So there's actually going to be, if this map is 1648, they're going to push even further up into Hungary, into the realm of Austria, into the Austrian Empire, and by the time they get to 1683 they are laying siege to the city of Vienna. Vienna is the capital of the Austrian Empire, the Kingdom of Austria, and it is right about here where I've got my pointer on the map. Ultimately, the Austrian forces are going to defeat the Turks, defeat the Ottomans here, and from that point on, the Ottomans are going to be in a slow and steady decline coming back this way. So kind of like we've seen with the Holy Roman Empire, and kind of like we talked about in the other section of some online notes, the decline of Spain, the Ottomans are going to hang around for a good while, and we'll see them periodically, but they're not going to be that of a major topic for us. They're always going to be kind of on the second tier on the European power structure. The third Eastern European country that is on the decline is Poland, or as it's marked here on the map, it is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So it is a commonwealth. It is a republic. It's kind of a constitutional monarchy because their parliament of nobles, they are more in charge than what the monarch is. They actually hold elections for their king, kind of like the old Holy Roman Empire did with their emperor for a good while. But the issue here for the monarchy is that they couldn't consolidate their authority over the nobility. This is really getting down to where it sounds a little bit like England, but it's really going to be bad news because of this power structure that's taking shape over here in the East. The big issue is like Parliament couldn't get much of anything done. Their parliament made use of what is called the liberum veto, which essentially meant for major legislative issues, their parliament had to have a unanimous vote in order to enact legislation. And since a unanimous vote is very difficult to do, even if you're talking like 2 or 3 people, much less several dozen people, well, Parliament's not doing much. The monarch's not really doing much. Therefore, Poland's not doing much. And this is happening at the same time that Peter the Great is coming into his own in Russia. And so ultimately, Poland is going to disappear from the map of Europe. So the second map I've got here, you can kind of tell where we are. This is kind of showing us like this part, this area of Poland that I'm kind of circling up here. So over the course of decades, and this is happening, and I should have a date on this. If you look at the second map, it's telling you it's the 1770s to the 1790s. So this will be seen in textbook reading in a couple of chapters, but where we are right now is Russia from the east, and this is more so under Catherine the Great, not Peter the Great, more on her in Unit 4, and then the growth of Austria from the south, and then Prussia from the west. They kind of just like take over what used to be Poland. Now, when it comes down to the countries in the east that are actually on the rise, well, go figure, that's Austria, Prussia, and Russia. And because of the way the textbook is set, and this is one of the few kind of quirks I've seen with the College Board that doesn't make much sense to me, they include the disappearance of Poland here in Unit 3, but they seem to, and with the rise of Russia, so I guess that makes sense. But when it comes down to the growth of Austria and the growth of Prussia, that's more of a Unit 4 issue for those two countries, and so we'll talk about them in a little bit more detail in a couple of weeks. But even though we spent some good time talking about Russia in class, let's see if we can recap some of what we've learned about Russia by watching our BBC video. So I would be lying to you if I told you that I was going to do a thorough job on this as opposed to the 2 days worth of BBC video that we watched. But I do feel like I need to try to place that video into the context of where we are with other issues in class. So the video kind of starts off by taking us from leaderless Russia and getting us to the point where they have absolute rulers, an absolute monarch. They start with Mikhail, or we can just call him Michael Romanov. That's the anglicized version of the Russian name Mikhail. He's there in 1613 to 1645. So this is roughly the same time as Louis the 13th in France. So during the 30 Years' War, before we get to the Sun King. And this is also during the reign of James I in England and the beginning of Charles I and the beginning of the English Civil War. So they're well behind some of the Western European developments. It is worth pointing out that this Romanov dynasty is going to hang around for 300 years. When we see Austria and Prussia in the next unit, we'll kind of say the same thing. These monarchies in Eastern Europe, they're going to have much more longevity of power than what we'll see over in the West. And then we talked about how Russia is kind of backwards, both in the sense that they are culturally medieval, but also they're reliant on subsistence agriculture and peasants and feudalistic hierarchies and serfs and things that were kind of going away in the West way back in Unit 1. They're being legitimized in Russia here and are going to stay that way throughout the entire Romanov dynasty. And you might be able to argue that they have an impact even in today's Russia. And then onto the scene comes Peter the Great, like the gigantic figure that he was. He is, like they talked about in class, he is going to bring in a heavy Western European influence from the English and the Dutch with all the maritime trade and the maritime industry and building the navy. The French influence because he's basically going to use Louis the 14th as a role model. And these are the ideas he is going to bring with him into Russia when he returns. When he returns to take care of the Streltsy revolt in 1698. And so when he crushes, it's an uprising of palace guards, but he feels like they've been directed by members of the nobility, and so he embarks on this huge westernization program, right? Western fashion, forcing the nobles to shave their beards, forcing the nobles to change their way of dress, expanding the military so he's got more control over the nobles on the home front, but also as a way to, wage war against Sweden. And then he puts in something called the Table of Ranks. Instead of members of the nobility being his top military advisors, his top government advisors, he starts kind of just promoting people that have been properly educated in a Western tradition and just are more of an expert in economy or in military or in bureaucracy, trying to mimic that Western European style of things. And he embarks on the Great Northern War against Sweden. The war does take 2 decades, not an easily won war, but a win nonetheless. And it is going to pave the way for him to create his window on the West in St. Petersburg. Think about like the level of absolute monarchy that this really represents, that he's not just building a new capital, but he's naming it after himself in a manner of speaking when it is St. Petersburg. And he even puts in his own version of the royal palace that the Winter Palace is like the Russian version of Versailles, except this huge city that's going to be built and developed. Peter's going to use this as a way to get more and more control over the nobility. So if you think about So if we think about this, excuse me, in the context of like an essay, here is an essay prompt that could be applied to Peter the Great in Russia. It is asking us to evaluate the most significant influence on the development of absolutism in Russia in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, which is very clearly going to be about Peter the Great. And so what I've got here is my version of how I might phrase an introductory paragraph on this. So there's some context that I'm trying to establish, and then there is the thesis statement itself. And I'm not a huge fan of reading off a slide to people, so you can pause me and read this on your own if you want to, but here we go. If I'm saying establishing context, through most of the 17th century, Russia lagged behind the economic and political growth of Western Europe. Makes sense, right? Monarchies in England, France, and Spain enriched themselves with New World colonies and consolidated their political control over their citizens. At the same time, however, Russia maintained a culture and economy that seemed comparatively medieval. Everything up to this point, this is all context. I am trying to demonstrate that I know what's going on in this time period and trying to talk about it in a way that I'm using it to set up the topic of this essay. So starting here, I have like a connection sentence. And I'm saying that by the turn of the 18th century, Russia had made significant strides toward catching up with these Western powers, thanks in large part to the leadership of Peter the Great. He's my focal point for this essay. And then starting here, I've got my thesis complete with a line of reasoning, where I'm saying that during his reign, Peter the Great was able to reinvent Russia. I'm borrowing that from the video, right? But he's doing this by bringing in new westernizing ideas such as absolutist control over the nobility and the development of a maritime economy, even though he maintains some traditional social structures like serfdom. So in this last sentence, in this thesis sentence, I'm trying not just to kind of like show that I am focused on Peter the Great and influencing the development of absolutism as an absolutist monarch, but I'm doing this by setting up, well, a couple of body paragraphs that he is trying to get control over the nobility. Rest assured, I'm going to have a paragraph about that, whether it's about St. Petersburg or whether it's about the nobles and the fashion and the beards. All of that comes in together. And then the development of a maritime economy, because, well, that's half of what that video was about, right? Was how Peter, copied ideas from the West. And I'm even putting a third paragraph in here where it says he's not really changing everything to be like the West because he's maintaining serfdom. And as a matter of fact, I think the video argues that he couldn't have done this without the institution of serfdom in his country. So here's one way you can see an example about how to build an intro paragraph. We will see at least one other example of this in class as we're prepping for our unit essay question at the end of the week, but this was worth it for me to get in here for you along these lines, and kind of wraps up any piece of conversation we would have left about balance of power or absolutism, at least for this unit here in early European history. So until we see each other in the next online lecture, have a good day.